In this video, I want to briefly look at the when Matthew was written and also the why. So when wanting to understand something about the timing of the writing of Matthew's gospel, it was sometime written before or after around 70 AD. So 70 AD is a decisive date because this is when the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans. And so what scholars oftentimes do is they look for hints or clues as to whether or not Matthew, the author of Matthew's gospel, is aware of this significant event. So Mark's gospel, which Matthew's gospel is oftentimes assumed to be using, is often dated in somewhere in the 60s of the first century because there doesn't seem to be any indication that the author is aware of what actually happens to the temple, and so then it becomes, kind of a question of did the author of Matthew's gospel, get a hold of Mark's gospel, and did he too compose before that temple was destroyed, or did he get Mark's gospel and now after the temple has been destroyed, he writes this gospel? So it does use the Gospel of Matthew, and so this is written prior to 70 AD, and so one has to keep that into consideration. But for some scholars, Matthew 24:20 makes little sense if it was written after 70 AD. So in Matthew 24:20, there is a saying of Jesus in which he says that about the kind of this important day that is getting ready to happen, this very decisive day, that they are to pray that it doesn't happen in the winter or doesn't happen on a Sabbath. And that's curious because the destruction of Jerusalem, although there was a long siege of Jerusalem before it finally fell, the actual falling of Jerusalem didn't happen until sometime in the spring. It didn't happen in the winter. And it doesn't really happen in a single day. It happened over, a long, extensive period. So the question would be, why would an author who knew how the destruction of the temple, how all that came about, why in the sayings of Jesus about the destruction of the temple, starting in Matthew 24, when he tells his disciples that they won't see one stone on top of another, why is it that he would place such a saying on the lips of Jesus when it didn't happen that way? Of course, someone could respond back and say, well, this author was, preserving the teaching of Jesus, and it didn't matter to him whether or not it happened in the exact way as Jesus, was thinking about. His responsibility is just to preserve, to write down what the saying was. But others see that, well, this is an indication that this author is not aware of how the temple was destroyed. So Matthew 24:20 is used by those who want to argue that the gospel was written prior to AD 70. Whereas others tend to think, well, if Mark was written in the 60s, you've got to give some time between the 60s till the time that Matthew will have gotten a hold of it and he will start his own writing activity. Some other things that about it is, for some, Matthew 22:7, which is a parable about a king destroying a city, that this has specific knowledge of Jerusalem's destruction. But I would say on this point that while it does indicate something of a destruction of a city, that is not proof enough that the author is reflecting upon how Jerusalem was destroyed, because it can be a typical thing that a army will do in destroying a city and burning a city. So just because Jerusalem was also burned is not indicating that this parable was written in light of or with the knowledge of what happened in Jerusalem. Other factors that people take into consideration is this church-synagogue relationship, that the idea of being cast out of their synagogue, and that Christians really didn't begin to experience a casting out of the synagogue until sometime after 70 AD. And to me, this is probably a little bit stronger, although not conclusive evidence. It is true that after AD 70, there seemed to be movements afoot to provide a more kind of normative Jewish expression of faith, and that what the Jewish Christians were proclaiming about Jesus comes to be seen as not in line with the theology or the views of those who are in the leadership of the synagogue. So there is this hostility that does grow. There was much more kind of diversity or tolerance about what could have been taught or held or believed in a pre-70 period. But after the destruction of the temple, who leads, who controls? Well, there grows a kind of a control of synagogues and control of the Jewish community amongst rabbis. So the church-synagogue relationship one. Christology and ecclesiology is something I mentioned in a previous video, that these are more developed in Matthew. I tend to not agree that they are that developed, in contrast to, say, the types of Christology and ecclesiology that one can find in other parts of the New Testament that probably were written prior to the time of Matthew's Gospel. But then there's also the kind of Trinitarian formula, where Jesus is kind of set alongside God the Father and God the Spirit, and that this reflects a much more kind of later view that Christians would have had. I'm not clear that the formula that we have in the Great Commission, to go and baptize and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, points to clearly a date after AD 70. But I do see that that kind of formula of baptizing in the name of those three, does suggest something that was probably done at a much later time than, say, in the first couple of decades. So it's going to have to be sometime before or after, and if it's worth whatever it may be worth the class, my own view is that it probably most likely is after 70 AD, but I do think that arguing for a pre-70 AD, there are good reasons to still hold or maintain that view. So I'm going to end here with why Matthew's Gospel was written. Well, it is likely to argue for a correct view of Jesus. If it has Mark's Gospel, it may be paying respect to Mark's Gospel by utilizing it, but it may also want to nuance Jesus, particularly Jesus' view toward the law, and so provide a more correct view of Jesus, because Mark's Gospel could leave the view that Jesus was putting away the law or dispensing of the law or was antagonistic to the law. And this author does not believe that would be a correct representation of Jesus. It certainly does seem to be instructions for discipleship. Of course, from the very beginning of the Gospel, with the Sermon on the Mount, we have these kind of instructions to disciples. At the very end of the Gospels, you have the teaching to go out and to make disciples. And you make disciples by teaching them to observe everything that Jesus taught. And so there's a lot about discipleship in this gospel, and becoming a disciple, becoming a one who learns, who puts into practice the things that Jesus did. You don't just confess him as Lord, you have to do the things that he taught. It may be to persuade others to follow Jesus, although I don't think it's likely that this gospel was written as an evangelistic tool to present Jesus. It certainly could be used maybe to present Jesus to non-Christian Jews in a certain way who may have heard or think that Jesus was antagonistic toward the law, or to explain why he would have been crucified or given to the Romans to be crucified by Jewish leaders. So, possibly to persuade others, if others, maybe non-Christian Jews, who have some kind of an appeal towards Judaism, but certainly did not want to go and become, proselytes, in other words, if they're males having to be circumcised, but somehow or another were drawn to the God that Jews were worshiping and seeing this Jesus as one who teaches about this God and wanting to learn, seeing Jesus as kind of their teacher and living the life that this God of Israel wants others, including non-Jews, to live. Some have argued that maybe the gospel is like a lectionary. In other words, the church was developing to where they had certain kind of practices, thoughts, readings of scriptures, organizing their worship, and that this gospel was utilized for that purpose. I don't really see a lot of strong evidence, or aware of a lot of strong evidence that makes me think that would be the case, but some people have argued that is why Matthew was written. But certainly as well to encourage faithfulness in the face of hostility. There are these teachings from Jesus in Matthew's gospel about having to face being cast out of synagogues, being flogged, being persecuted, praying for your enemies, pray for those who will want to hurt you and persecute you. So there is that in the gospel, and Jesus is seen kind of as a model of someone who was able to face hostility, though he was killed. Maybe after AD 70, there may be some hostilities directed to Christians for some reasons, either by Gentiles, by the government, by the Romans themselves for some reason, although that didn't really happen until much later towards the end of the first century. But maybe it's encouraging faithfulness. So lots of different reasons why Matthew may have been written for them. I think, if anything, is probably the correct view of Jesus, and the instructions for discipleship seem to me to be two of the biggest purposes for the gospel. And so we'll leave it there with the when and why of Matthew's gospel.